So today we're going to take a look at what's going to happen if Russia tries to form an empire in 2025. This video is going to be very unrealistic. All events that are going to happen are purely fictional. Major alliances like NATO, CSTO, the EU or the UN, they do not exist in my videos. If they would exist, they would not let these countries to expand. Also, before we get into this video, I want to ask you guys to subscribe to the channel. If you guys enjoy mapping animation stuff, also subscribe to the second channel where I upload Age of History 3 videos. But yeah, now let's get right into the video. Russia is the second strongest country in the world in the modern day. Up until the 1990s, they used to have control over all of these countries. The Soviet Union broke apart, and we're gonna disregard the war that they have in Ukraine. Yeah, we don't want that to happen right now. But if Russia was gonna form an empire, the first thing that would happen is Belarus would reunite with the Russians. There is literally no need for Belarus, especially if the Russians want to form an empire. And after this, oh, forgot to call in Kaliningrad. I always forget this. But yeah, after this, without even having to militarize their country, would definitely go after the Estonians, the Latvians, and the Lithuanians. Yeah, taking out all of the Baltic nations because they can. So yeah, now let's see. We can see that the Russian forces have now arrived on the borders, and they start a push into Estonia, following the coastline. And eventually, we can see that they were easily able to get to Tallinn, the capital city of Estonia. Down in the south, they start a push into Lithuania from their exclave of Kaliningrad. They also push in from here, securing the capital city of Lithuania, after which the country surrenders. Up in the north, they continue their push in Estonia until eventually most of the armies are defeated, so the country surrenders. And the same Russian troops now push up into Latvia, cutting the country in two parts. Eventually, the western part surrenders, and they push into the eastern parts, where again, after most of the armies were defeated, or after the surrender of most of the army, the remaining country surrenders. The Baltic invasion was pretty easy for these guys. All of these countries got completely annexed by the Russian Empire, and now these European countries are pretty scared. Poland now shares a much bigger border with Russia. This happened after the annexation of Belarus, but yeah, after all of that, we can see that the Russians now turn their focus to the east, where they want to revive their Central Asian control once again. And now for that, we can see that they send an ultimatum to these countries. They send an ultimatum to Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan. Funny enough, none of these guys actually accept the ultimatum, and because they did not accept the ultimatum, we can see that the Russians now declare war on Kazakhstan. So let's see. We can see that the Russian forces are now on the border with Kazakhstan, and they start to push down from here, where their goal is to eventually get to the capital city. The Kazakh troops are heavily outnumbered here. They cannot push these guys back, and because the Russians are kind of aware about the terrain and all the stuff, because Kazakhstan used to be a part of the Soviet Union, they easily got to the capital city. After the fall of the capital city, even though this was all the progress made by the Russians, the remaining parts of the country surrender, as some people in it were kind of in the support of the Russian annexation. And yeah, Kazakhstan got completely annexed. This now is giving the Soviet Union vibes. But yeah, after these guys saw what happened to Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, as well as Uzbekistan accept the previous ultimatum because they were really scared. After Tajikistan sees that they now border the Russian Empire, they too surrender. Turkmenistan is gonna chill for now. The Russians are refocusing their troops into Europe. Dictator guy wants to live a prosperous life, and then he would, I guess, give up the country. But yeah, since the Russians have refocused their troops into Europe, some of these countries are really worried, and yeah, I guess it's understandable because they have this gigantic thing right on their border. And right now, Russia borders Ukraine, Poland, as well as Finland here. So pretty much all of these three countries are pretty strong, but the Russians do something else here. They had a pretty formidable navy in the Black Sea, and yeah, they want to enter Eastern Europe, but since they don't want to go against Ukraine, Poland, or Finland, we can see that they declare war on Bulgaria, which is a pretty random country here, but this was the only way of entering Eastern Europe. Bulgaria is biting its nails as it sees the Russian navy now arriving on its coastline. They were unable to prevent this naval landing. The Russians follow the Danube River, and they eventually get to the capital city of Sofia, easily taking the capital city from the Bulgarians, and then they take the Danube regions. They push down and get to Varna. But yeah, after all of this chaos, the remaining parts of Bulgaria surrender. This was a side quest for the Russians because Bulgaria is really not a main country, but this does give the Russians access to the Eastern European countries. This also makes the Serbs very happy. They might just go ahead and declare war on Kosovo, as they now have direct support from the Russians. But yeah, the Russians, they got to Eastern Europe. These countries are really worried, and it seems like they're pretty much unstoppable right now. They do send an army back. They sent this army to the Caucasus, where they want to invade another country. This country is going to be Georgia. But again, in Georgia, they have these proxies who are willing to support the Russians. And I know Georgia has a pretty mountainous terrain. It takes the Russians a very long time, but eventually they push in, securing these regions, making little to no gains, but some gains at least. Eventually they get to the capital city of Tbilisi. They take the capital city of the Georgians, and the remaining parts of Georgia surrender after the capture of the capital city. And in a peace negotiation, we can see that all of Georgia got completely annexed by the Russian Empire. After this, we can see that they send an ultimatum to Azerbaijan and Armenia, demanding their annexation. Azerbaijan does not accept the ultimatum right now. Armenia does accept. And to finish things off in the east, we can see that finally the Russians now declare war on Turkmenistan. So yeah, now let's see. Immediately we can see that the Russian troops storm into Turkmenistan. This is how much they storm in, and they eventually get to the capital city. They take it with relative ease. They secure all of the western parts. The eastern half surrenders after realizing that the dictator has left the country. Turkmenistan also surrenders, and now the entirety of Central Asia is once again under the Russian control. And things are going great for the Russians, but what they did not expect was a coalition which was being formed against them in Eastern Europe. We can see that the Ukrainians, the Polish, and the Finnish, they kind of knew what was going to happen eventually in the future. They knew that they were going to get invaded by the Russians. And so, in order to prevent that somehow, we can see that they form a coalition against the Russians, hoping to defeat the Russians altogether, combining their forces. But I don't know how this is going to go, but let's see. We can see that because the Russian army was not concentrated in Eastern Europe, the Ukrainians start their offensive down in the south. They push into Crimea, eventually securing the entire region, kicking out the Russians from here. We can see that the Polish get Kaliningrad. They secure the region easily, and the Finnish troops are also making some slower gains. They get very close to St. Petersburg, which is a major Russian city over here. We can see that the Ukrainians start to push into mainland Russia, thinking that they might have a chance. They also push into Russia from here, making some smaller gains. The Polish continue their Baltic invasion, securing these regions in the Baltics, eventually pushing up and encircling this entire region of what was previously Latvia. The Finnish could not take St. Petersburg, but they still continue their push in hopes of cutting the Russians off from the northern parts. The Ukrainians now start to push up into. The Ukrainians now are trying to get to Moscow, which is the Russian capital city. This half of the Russian Empire surrenders, and the Polish continue their push up. Things are going great for these guys. We can see that the Finnish, they now also start to push down. Them and the Ukrainians are trying to get to the capital city of Moscow. But yeah, after all of this, the Russians have mobilized their army, and things might not be looking very good for all of these countries. However, the Ukrainians do continue their push in the south, making a lot of gains down here, while they also push up a little bit more. But now the Russian armies have arrived, they're fully mobilized, and things might not be looking great for these countries. Immediately we can see that the Finnish, they get pushed back all the way to up here. St. Petersburg also has been secured. We can see that the second army arrives on this front line. They push back the Ukrainians, and they push them all the way back to their borders. The Ukrainians now go defensive mode. And over here in the Baltics, the Polish also get pushed back real bad, and the Russians, they were able to push in and cut off the Polish troops up here, who are now left at the mercy of the Russians. They also secure Kaliningrad down here, and the Ukrainians down in the south also get pushed back. And eventually the Russians now start their own push into Ukraine, securing all of the eastern regions. Guys, this might take years, so not an easy job. The Polish troops up here surrender, and again we can see that the Russians make their own push into Poland. The Finnish, they also get pushed back all the way to their borders. The Russians also now start to push into Finland. The Russian Navy also comes into action as they make a naval landing down in the southern parts of Ukraine, and they start to push in. We can see that Crimea was retaken, and they push up from here too. All of the eastern provinces are secured because most of the Polish army was gone up here. The Russians push in, capturing Warsaw, and because of that the Polish surrender. The Russians make a pretty strategic plan to capture Kyiv. For that we can see that they push in. Because most of the Ukrainian army was here, they were able to capture Kyiv. They start to push down, cutting off Ukraine into two parts. The eastern part surrender. And up here, we can see that Helsinki was secured. Because of that, the Finnish are out of this war. Now it's only the Ukrainians against the Russians. And yeah, the Ukrainians, without sustainable support from the West, which, you know, in this scenario, that's the case, is unable to push back the Russians until finally, after most of their armies were destroyed, they go ahead and surrender. Yeah, this was a pretty bad decision taken by all of these countries. And in a peace negotiation, we can see that all of these countries got completely annexed by the Russian Empire. The Azerbaijanis saw what happened to the Eastern Europeans. Before the Russians could declare war, they go ahead and accept the ultimatum. This is the best decision that they could have taken. The Russians send an ultimatum to Moldova, which these guys had to accept. Pretty much all of Europe now is afraid of the Russian Empire. Yeah, they're not going to be stopping here. As to connect their two strips of land here, they declare war on the Romanians, who are surrounded by the Russians on two sides and the Russian Navy on the third side. So yeah, things are not looking good for Romania. The Russians cross the Danube River, straight up taking the capital city of Bucharest, and they start a push into Romania. They once again follow the Danube River, taking city after city until eventually most of the major parts of Romania were taken. And yeah, they too had to go ahead and surrender. This is what the Russian Empire looks like right now. They're massive. They finished things off with sending some ultimatums to these Eastern European countries. Serbia was struggling to survive, so they become a part of the Russian Empire. They sent an ultimatum to Hungary and Slovakia. These guys accepted the ultimatums. But yeah, this is pretty much the Russian Empire at its peak. This is gonna be it for today's video. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe, leave a comment, and tell me what you guys want to see in the future. And thank you for watching.